I was watching a video by Tigan Moon, which I'll leave linked down below, about Dissidia and how it ended up basically disappearing off the face of the earth. And it reminded me of just how much time I used to spend playing my PSP back at my old games club, and indeed the amount of time I've spent on this very channel talking about the franchise. And combining that with the amount of comments I still get discussing Omnia 2 years after I'd stopped covering and a year after the game had disappeared entirely, I'd come to a bit of a conclusion. I actually really miss Dissidia, and by the sounds of things, I think you guys do too. Now, I'm not going to go into the full history of the Dissidia franchise because quite frankly, the video that Tigan Moon has presented does that far better than I ever could. But what I can talk about is my personal connection to it, this channel's connection to it, and hopefully speak to how you guys are connected to it as well. So as we all know, the original PSP Dissidias were really celebrated for how unique their combat systems were, namely the bravery system. And part of the celebration of the game is the ability to customize your character to however you wanted them to be. And there was a wide variety of characters to play in Dissidia and Dissidia Duodecim. You could equip them with a range of different accessories and equipment. There was a different assortment of attacks that you could use with all sorts of different characters and loadouts that you could go into, which is something that fighting games don't typically do. I've also personally really struggled with other anime style fighters. I'm not much of an anime person, which probably comes as a bit of a shock to people knowing that I'm a big JRPG fan, but I've tried playing games like Naruto or One Piece or Kill la Kill, and they just don't feel the same. They feel really empty by comparison towards Dissidia. There is a Bleach game coming out that I believe Tigan Moon actually mentions in his video that I believe is coming out in the next year or so that looks like it is adopting some of the mechanics from it, but it still doesn't quite look the same. Dissidia is a very unique mechanically sound system that requires precision and timing, and you can't just button mash your way through it like you can with a lot of the just arena fighters, because you have to actually pay attention to what you're doing and what your opponent is doing, and you end up with this choreographed dance that's just really impressive to watch as well as play. Risk and reward is also a big part of it as well. Like, if you land an HP attack on your opponent, you actually don't have any bravery at the end of it. This video is going to go through assuming that those of you who are watching will know the mechanics of Dissidia, so the bravery system and how you would build bravery points up to then land an HP attack, but you're then left with none. So if your opponent knows what they're doing, it's actually very easy to make a comeback from that. So you have this real back and forth that is present like you would in a fighting game, except it's featuring all of our favourite Final Fantasy characters. I mentioned that I used to play Dissidia on my PSP back at my Friday night club, which I did. I used to run a club where every Friday people would all gather in a church hall and we'd all play various board games, card games, video games, all sorts of things. We're talking back in like 2006, 2007. And I never got to play or host a real tournament environment with Dissidia because I'd be one of very few people who were even interested in it. But it would have been amazing to have taken part in a community that combines two of my favourite things: Final Fantasy and competitive fighting games. And I know that there is a competitive scene still for the original Dissidias, but it's always done through things like emulation and stuff now. And we all know that while emulation is amazing, it still doesn't feel quite the same. And let's face it, even though the multiplayer was a big part of Dissidia as a whole, one could still enjoy it massively through its single player content. The story is ultimately nonsensical, to be honest, but it's fun, which is all it really needed to be. The fan service is extremely strong, getting characters from different games to interact, getting some characters to act in ways that we hoped they would have done in their original game. I mean, fun fact, Kuja, which is the character I'm probably most well associated with, became my favourite character because of the original Dissidia, not Final Fantasy IX. And it was after I've played Dissidia that I went back and really dived into the character in his original game. Something that was always amazing in those first two games as well is something that I feel we've really lost to time in video games altogether, and it makes me really sad, which is the number of unlockables that were present. The number of unlockables in those original two games were staggering and existed long before microtransactions even existed, and we'll get to more on that later. I think a big reason that I and many people still really love the original Dissidias, and the entire franchise as a whole to be honest, is just the meticulous attention to detail and the reverence to the franchise that it comes from. Like, the art style for each of the characters being drawn from Yoshitaka Amano's original art was an inspired decision. The fact that you've got alternate outfits, which did become DLC and microtransactions later, and I did spot that, but they were still inspired by the original sprites. Like, you could have Warrior of Light in his original red garb, which was always a really cool thing. Having the HP attacks match the UI of the games that they originate from, the stages, all of it, it's just so reverent, and it's just so impactful to people who love these games. Now, one thing that I will disagree with a lot of people on, and I know that this is true for most people, but a lot of people think Duodecim completely invalidates the original Dissidia. And for the most part, I do agree. The roster is bigger, you have assist attacks, a grander story mode, but one of my favourite things about the original Dissidia before Duodecim was the Dual Labyrinth, which was like a board game, roguelike part of the game that I was obsessed with. I just couldn't put it down. It was really simple, you just kept going, and you were really challenging your own abilities and the equipment that you'd gained by playing the game just over and over again. I really enjoyed doing that. And the Dual Labyrinth is present in Duodecim, but the changes they make to it just didn't scratch the itch for me quite the same way. But for the most part, I can see why people would say that about Duodecim. For the longest time, I think if you had asked me what the game I had played the most, as in put the most hours into, would have been, I probably would have told you it was Dissidia. Just straight up, regular Dissidia, not Duodecim. And so you can imagine that for the longest time, I'd always wondered what a home console version of Dissidia would look like, devoid of the limitations of the PSP. And one day, of course, I would get to find out, but just not in the way I probably would have hoped. I do remember actually seeing the trailer for Dissidia Arcade Edition for the very first time on YouTube, but being really disappointed that it was only going to be released in Japan and it being an arcade game. This was nearly 10 years ago now, and it wouldn't be for another 3 years till we got it as Dissidia NT on home consoles. But of course, all of the elegance of the original Dissidia games, all of the nice cool choreography, it's gone in NT. Having 6 characters on the screen on huge maps that require chasing each other down for the majority of the match results with a mess of particle effects and flying people and summons that take way too long to interact with. All the character loadouts have gone, characters could only bring a single HP attack instead of a full suite of them, and stages were all just empty places with pretty backdrops. Basically, I'd gotten more excited about the trailers for the characters for Dissidia NT than Dissidia NT itself, because all of the soul had just been sucked out of Dissidia to make it. Now, don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed NT. I lived with copium with NT, to be quite honest. I loved the idea of coordinating a team of players together to join up and take on the world with our favourite Final Fantasy characters. And I got to Mithril rank with Vayne, so the first DLC character, I played for a long while after he came out. I'd played Kuja before that, didn't really like how they'd changed him because they'd sucked all the personality out of him and stopped him from being this cool mid-rangey character that didn't really work in any other situation into this kind of rubbishy character that just had to be super specific with his timing on when you were going to hit things and it not feeling very rewarding for doing so. But I digress. For some bizarre reason, the issue that comes with trying to coordinate 6 people to play together is that, for some bizarre reason, Dissidia NT runs off of delay-based netcode. And because you need 6 people, if anyone has even the slightest amount of lag, everybody feels it and the whole thing just cascades and falls apart. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that most of my time playing Dissidia NT was spent in the waiting room looking for people to play with. And I played that game a lot. I think a big part of what happened with NT is that because it was trying so hard to be an esport and falling flat on its backside doing it, it was so worried about being balanced. And games in general these days are too worried about being balanced. And I understand why, but looking back at some of the biggest hits of this genre, RPG and fighting games, including the original Dissidia, balance was far from the first game's priority. In the original Dissidia, not necessarily duodecim, but with just original Dissidia, it was well known that Ultimisia, if she was able to get her hands on you, would demolish you with near infinite combos. And trying to take on a well-playing Exdeath was an exercise in futility to a casual player. But if you look at games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which is one of the most beloved fighting games of all time, and is still being celebrated 20 odd years later in the Marvel vs. Capcom collection, they're as beloved as they are, despite being so imbalanced. And in some ways, because of it, removing all of the equipment, the RPG elements, the character customization, the grind rails and the cool ways in which you can interact with the environment, it just left a bit of an empty husk of a game. As a matter of fact, echoing the sentiments of Tigan Moon's video, which was the video that inspired me to make this one, Dissidia NT may well be my biggest disappointment in video game history, and that's saying a lot. I'm an Alien fan and I played Colonial Marines. Now bizarrely, NT was also accompanied by a mobile title, Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, which was released on the same worldwide release date of January 2018, having followed a year in which it was Japan only. Now, Opera Omnia was always going to be met with scrutiny. It's a mobile title with gacha elements and has a very, very starkly different art style to what we had seen in Dissidia NT. NT's character models and stuff are still being used to this day because they are the gold standard of those characters. I know that Brave Exvius has been shut down recently, but until then, Dissidia NT's models were still being used for the limit breaks that were present in that game. So they were definitely a hallmark of what you see from those characters, and they'd been shrunk down into these chibified styles for Opera Omnia. And honestly, I think it's deserved that Opera Omnia would be met with so much scrutiny being a gacha title. People would go out of their way to spend insane amounts of money to stay on top of the game. I would know, I was one of them. For the longest time, I actually, and even now, still wonder if Opera Omnia would have been as successful as it was if in NT hadn't been such a failure, or if it would have compounded its success. But to be honest with you, when the game first came out, it proved to become a spin on the Dissidia systems that had already been set in place that proved that those systems could adopt the turn-based nature of the Final Fantasy franchise that fathered the Dissidia franchise in the first place. Opera Omnia combined the bravery system with a conditional turn-based system similar to that of Final Fantasy X, and it worked shockingly well. At least at first. By the end of its service at the start of 2024, Opera Omnia had 179 characters in it, exploring some of the most niche characters one could possibly imagine in the Final Fantasy franchise, making it a real celebration of all that came before. And speaking from a personal perspective, I don't gravitate towards gacha games very much, but for the first couple of years of the game's runtime, Opera Omnia was shockingly good at crafting a real video game experience rather than a simple collectathon like other gachas of its time. It was exciting to find characters like Freya or Pain that performed really well despite not having access to as many weapons as flagship characters, or what we like to call 35 CP legends back in the day, because it encouraged players to think with their heads and not their wallets. Of course, this was the Opera Omnia that I originally fell in love with, and we'll get to where that all fell apart, don't you worry. Because the difficulty of the challenge stages was genuinely tough and created conversation about how we could tackle those stages as a community, replacing the positive, healthy, competitive discussions of the original Dissidia with a cooperative one instead. I mean, it certainly did a better job of it than NT did. I loved that each of the characters had their own niches and place within the roster of the game. For example, characters like Lena could ward off status effects, while Kefka's debuffs were just a tiny bit stronger than everybody else's. And combat encounters were often built in such a way that they were challenging, but there was always multiple ways to beat them, meaning that the player was rarely left out to dry. And I believe that the game's operating in that way is why it still has such a devout following, despite the fact that it came crashing down as time went on. However, gachas are gachas, and they attract a particular crowd, and so there was always a looming feeling, certainly to me, that the conversations of strategy and favourite characters and story and all the things that we love to talk about in video games ordinarily would depart from that into a different beast altogether. And unfortunately, as somebody who was very much at the epicenter of Opera Omnia's trajectory, the conversation did indeed revolve around a different topic, one that I feel has no place in gaming at all: money. As time went on, people would ask questions in my streams or general conversation less about how one was going to tackle a particular event, who their favourite characters were, etc, etc, and every conversation would boil down to two questions. Did you pull? How much did it cost you? And I have to say, that conversation got real boring really fast. And I have to ask, when people ask how much it cost you to get something like that, I have to ask those people, because I imagine some of you will be watching this video as people who have followed me for that game previously. Why do you care? Why does it matter how much someone else spent to get something that you want or got? Everyone's journey is individual. I always used to really not understand why gacha creators would block out their resource numbers on their streams and stuff. But as time's gone on, I actually really am very understanding as to why they do that now. I feel this was really heavily magnified as the game went on, and as it went on, the whole roster just became homogenized, and the game lost its luster because of the way power creep works, certainly in Japanese live service games. The numbers must go up. And in this particular case, by the time the game started to wrap up, or certainly by the time that I'd left and lost interest in the game entirely, if you weren't dealing 10 bravery attacks and HP attacks with 3 debuffs and an extra buff on every button on a single button, you just weren't performing. And because of that, the game had become so ridiculously easy to beat that it just didn't feel rewarding anymore. My own videos became a chore to make because the answer to a strategy, which was the bit in the videos I was always excited to talk about, would always end up being, just do what you want, because you'll beat it anyway. And ultimately, this meant that Opera Omnia kinda suffered the same fate NT did. Except with this one, because it's a live service game, and once upon a time it was really good, people like to hold on to the Halcyon days and pretend that they'll come back. And I hate to tell you this, it's never gonna happen. At the end of the day, I do actually think that both Dissidia NT and Dissidia Opera Omnia kind of deserve their fate, purely because of mismanagement, really. Dissidia NT was kind of doomed from the start. It forgot entirely why people loved the original Dissidia games in the first place, to try and cater to an audience that weren't really asking for a Dissidia game to be like that. There were pockets of people that did take it seriously and were competitive with it, but having lost the single player aspect, having lost that customization, you weren't going to appeal to the right crowd. And then with Opera Omnia, there was a bit of a lightning in a bottle situation with that. It was a genuinely really strong gaming experience for quite some time, and it proved that the Dissidia mechanics can work in a turn-based setting. But realistically, I don't believe any Dissidia game since the original PSP titles, or actually any game at all, has really captured the essence of the Final Fantasy franchise in the same way. Not even Final Fantasy XIV, with the amount of references that makes to Final Fantasy games past. But that's because we've always had to deal with some concession in order to get there. With NT, it was the cluttered team-based systems, and the fact that unfortunately it was a bit of a crappy game, and with Opera Omnia, the conversation and the reverence was always tainted by the gacha model, and having to sidestep the conversations that ultimately became about money. And so, I think that if we're to see a Dissidia game in the future, we really need to return to the drawing board and remember why people love the original so much, myself included. I think at starting point, I'd love to see a remaster of Duodecim. I think that just grabbing that game, even if it is only going to realistically appeal to the crowd that loved it to begin with, maybe those who discovered Dissidia through NT or Opera Omnia and wanted to know where it came from, I think having that on a home console with just Dissidia NT's models would be incredible. That's asking for a lot, I know it is, but I'd love to see it. Just that beauty that NT displayed, but with the artistic vision and gameplay mechanics of the originals. It would be a match made in heaven, and I'd love to see it. And with regards to the turn-based variant, if a new Opera Omnia were to come about, yeah, I would absolutely play it. But it's important to remember that Dissidia NT doesn't have a big player base, but if you want one, let's make one. If you are interested in playing Dissidia NT together, I'm still hunting for a platinum trophy for it to add to my Final Fantasy collection, so I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to play some in the future. I can crack out all the characters, I'll still love my Warrior of Light, I'll still love my Vayne, I'll still love my Kuja, I'll happily play the game. But I think it's important to look at these things objectively and try and understand where they went wrong and where it could go right in the future. And with regards to Omnia, if I were to do videos on something like that in the future, it would be done very, very differently. And I will implore you, all of you guys that are asking me to continue to talk about Omnia all the time, the game is gone. I stopped playing it a year before it finished. I am probably not the best person for you to come to when it comes to Omnia. Don't get me wrong, I love that you guys still want it and you still love it. There are people, I believe, who are working on like a way of keeping it alive. And I encourage you to go and support that project, because I think that if it means that much to you, you should support that. But at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, it is a moment of my past, and it's one that I look back at both very fondly and with fear, because a lot of people like to forget that I was very heavily bullied during that time too. And also, by the way, I know that there are projects that do like 4K upscaling for the original Dissidia, and I'm totally down for trying that, but I am rubbish with that kind of thing. So if anyone wants to help me do that, I am so down to play some matches of original Dissidia with you. My Kuja needs to come out of the closet that he's been trapped in for God knows how many years. So you guys tell me, what is your most cherished Dissidia experience? For me, it is definitely sitting in that corner on a Friday night, playing my Kuja by myself on a Friday night at my old club. It's one of those memories that sticks in my head so much. And I actually want to give a real shout out to Tiger Moon for the video that they made. It really just opened my mind a lot to a lot of what I'd kind of been shutting off from myself. And realistically, I do miss the franchise a lot, and I really hope that we do get to see it again at some point in the future. So Square Enix, if you happen to be watching this, then I'd love to, I want more Dissidia, and I'm sure a lot of people do. But comment below with what your favourite moment or memory of the Dissidia franchise is, because I'm sure a lot of us have them. And if you're not sure what to comment, just type the world algorithm. It's really helpful for engagement's sake, so thank you very much if you do. And with that, I will shall love you and leave you. If you're new to my channel and are watching this, by the way, I am somebody that used to do a lot of coverage for Dissidia, Final Fantasy, Omnia, and so if you've enjoyed this content and you'd like to hear more from me about JRPGs, Nintendo stuff, I've just come back from a World Championship for Nintendo, and I actually won, by the way, for what it's worth, then consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then I have an art store as well that I do handmade drawings and portraits of various video game characters, and you'll find plenty of Final Fantasy ones in there. If you would like a print, then consider purchasing one of those, or you can join up on my Patreon through the link in the description box below. Thank you ever so much, everybody, and have a lovely day. I'll see you soon. Take care.